Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be an international breakdown. So just because we have some downtime now for FPL, I do think it's interesting to actually look back at some of the key player involvement so far, and also to have a look at team strengths and our sort of ideas of teams compared to, let's say, last season, and maybe mixing in a bit of both, to be quite honest. So starting off with the first part of this episode, we're looking at expected goal involvement. And what I've done here is I've outlined the effectively top 30 players in FPL in terms of expected goal involvement. And it's really helpful to actually see here that, of course, we do expect that the midfielders and forwards do benefit the most from this. These are the attacking players, but we still have two defenders who have been exceptional so far. And of course, we'll talk about them last. But in terms of the midfielders, actually, what I've done as well across all the positions is I've outlined some players, with red points in terms of FPL, but actually, of course, have really, really good expected goal involvement. And what we can say is that based on the positions from the first four games of football, of course, Luton Town and Burnley have played one less game than everyone else. But in reality, right, when we're looking at these players from these top teams, at least these top half teams, or even some teams that are, for example, in the bottom half, but have a talisman effectively, you are looking at some players here who have underperformed so far. But in general, as you can see, a lot of the players who've done well, as we've already seen, have really, really good expected goal involvement. And the idea, of course, is just simply looking at the positioning that they take, the assists, the expected assists that they give, combining that with the expected goals, as I mentioned, and then looking at that combined as an overall metric. You can actually see this metric on the FPL website, but what I've done, of course, is I've collated all the players here, added in their FPL points, put some red highlights in for some players who've underperformed. But actually, what I'd like to say about these players who've underperformed so far, if I just quickly go through them, is that that's a really promising sign. And the reason why it's a promising sign is because if you are actually consistently building up expected goal involvement, it is just a matter of time before you get a multitude of points really backing that up. Even if you're a very, very unclinical finisher. I think Darwin is such a good example of that, where even though he's had such a limited time out for this Liverpool team, he's amassed a good enough expected goal involvement to still get something like 21 points. And that's just basic logic, where if you're getting into good positions, or if you're creating really good positions for someone to shoot in, you're going to benefit from that. And of course, someone like Fernandes last season really struggled more so from the expected assist point of view. So it is actually a little bit poor to see him start off once again, underperforming, but that might be a case, of course, his teammates. We do have Højlund coming in. Yes, a little bit of calamity with this United team. I won't talk about that for this video, but you do hope, of course, that they can improve with, let's say, Højlund actually finding a starting place in the team, and then building on from, Anthony being excused from the team, and Sancho, of course, with his, training mishap or whatever. But of course, this is an early good sign for Fernandes because he's also a penalty taker. So you know that there's future avenues to getting good expected goal involvement as well. So I really do like that. As far as Salah, we also know that he missed a penalty. So not surprising that he's underscored a little bit in terms of FPL. When you look at someone like Eze, very healthy once again because he actually hasn't gotten a penalty so far. So the fact that this is all coming from open play and Eze still has 2 good games to go, did well in the previous game, suggests that, of course, Eze remains as a very, very good asset going forwards, and we should definitely not look down on someone like him. Enzo, very, very surprising, of course, that he's up this far. I do think part of that, of course, is simply the penalty that he took. Even if you take away that penalty, though, he is an absolute odd one out where at this sort of price point, you're not really expecting Enzo to be here, but he is. He's probably still going to be the penalty taker for this Chelsea team. And ultimately, he's got into really good goal-scoring positions, even creative positions. The question, of course, could be, will Enzo move, let's say, further back into the field to help Chelsea dominate the midfield a little bit more, to control a bit more tempo? Or will Enzo continue to play in the sort of advanced position that he's been taking up in recent matches? That's one thing you have to think about. I do think Enzo's an interesting pick if we're talking about, let's say, creating a very, very strong, let's say, Salah Haaland draft in the future. He could be one where you can actually think about, okay, shall we look at him as a kind of midfielder who gap spaces our team effectively? And then in terms of, let's say, Paqueta and Doucouré, not too interesting to me. I do think that, of course, West Ham and Everton have gotten great chances in recent games, but of course, these two players have been a little bit poor in terms of the underperformance. Are they consistent assets? I'd say not really, because if you look at Paqueta, you can still be looking at someone like Bowen. And even if you're looking at someone like Doucouré, I think going forwards, you'd hope that Danjuma would do better. And also Danjuma's at an elite price has had less minutes so far. So he's also a very, very alarming option. You can see, of course, he's been an underperformer so far too, but scoring the previous game. So these are the kind of early signs we like to see from players from the midfield position. I think all these players, honestly, in this list are quite healthy, with, as I said, with exception really to Paqueta and Doucouré. Obviously, with some of the Brighton assets, you know that it's a matter of fixtures and form too. So they've got tougher fixtures, so you're expecting them to do a little bit poorer ahead. And when you look at someone like Mbuma, for example, who still has decent fixtures, he's a very, very easy keep at the moment, especially leading this really, I think, prestigious list. Even topping, let's say, Haaland for expected goal involvement when they're both penalty takers is super interesting. And then looking at, say, to the forward position, of course, Jackson is clearly sticking out like a sore thumb here. One of the few forwards who's really underperformed. So 10 points compared to a lot of people in this category where they have less expected goal involvement and are already deep into the 20s. So I do think Jackson so far has been very unclinical. He's shown a lack of composure, but the reality is when you're getting that many chances consistently and you're actually getting that many minutes as well from Pochettino, I really think Jackson is still very close to many good hauls, and it's still very promising early signs so far. When you look and let's say compare to someone like Sterling, who's done incredibly well already, you can see that Jackson still absolutely trumps him in terms of expected goal involvement. So that's actually a good sign for me to say I would hold Jackson if I was a Jackson owner. And the same thing I would say, of course, with someone like João Pedro. With Mateus Cunha, I really don't think there's a need to really go for him at this moment in time. The simple reality, of course, is we probably don't want to be investing into these Wolves players. But you can even see, for example, someone like a Neto is incredibly good so far. And actually, looking back at last season, for example, when Gary O'Neill came into this Bournemouth team, the one thing that he did dramatically improve was actually the attack. And so it's a little bit promising to see, of course, Wolves build on really good expected goal involvement so far. I'd like to still see a little bit more before we genuinely consider some of these options. Of course, if you're looking at someone like Neto, of course, if he continues to be on this serious great run of form and still has the underlying stats, then of course he can be a very simple, easy pick to move into in the future, particularly, as I said, when we're looking at maybe actually combining, let's say, Salah and Haaland in future wildcard drafts, or even just within a kind of team concept. As far as Darwin, of course, it's really nice to see him do good. This is even with Darwin having very, very few minutes. So when you look at, let's say, players like Darwin and João Pedro, the fact that they haven't had too many minutes so far, but they have really good expected goal involvement at their sort of price is really, really appetizing. So I do think going forwards, you're looking at these two players as arguably keeps, right? Because Darwin could be someone that you're actually investing into, whereas João Pedro, a lot of people have been selling, but he actually could still be a very interesting pick. We know that Ferguson has picked up an injury. We know that Welbeck is still out, and of course Enciso out for a prolonged time. So I do really still like João Pedro as a pick. Of course, I was someone who actually moved out of João Pedro to Alvarez last week, but the simple reality was that Fulham game versus that Newcastle game on paper was a dramatic world of difference. Whereas if you're keeping João Pedro now, could actually be a very good time to keep him. And then when we're looking at the defenders, I think both Cash and Chilwell, when you see that they're actually so close to some of the top midfielders in the game in expected goal involvement, that already tells you how great these players are on paper so far. Cash, of course, it's a little bit dependent on, let's say, when Moreno comes back into the team and how his position, for example, in this team will change. He's been a great attacker so far, and still, I've actually classified him as underperforming, even though he's got 21 FPL points. So that's already insane, really, for a defender. But as I said, because him and Chilwell are effectively playing like wingers in their corresponding team so far, and the fact that they're underperforming is a really nice recipe to say that these are players that you still want to be going into. I know Cash already has gotten a price rise, and Chilwell himself, for example, he's actually someone where a lot of people are a little bit lower off, and I can completely understand that, because the simple reality is we've seen some early substitutions for Chilwell, so he could still be someone where we think about offloading him, let's say in a future wildcard. But at the same time, when you're looking at someone like Chilwell, I probably wouldn't be selling him in the near future. And that's really the same sort of point of view, I would say, with all these Chelsea assets, where they still have good runs of games until 8. And that's really it for the leading players in terms of expected goal involvement. If you don't see a player here, it might be for very specific reasons, right? For example, Foden missing a game due to sickness, coming on late. Jesus, for example, injured as well, coming on late. And that kind of changes, for example, whether a player gets really good expected goal involvement. This is not kind of like a conclusive list of players that you should buy or shouldn't buy. And ultimately, I just think it's interesting to see who's been performing so far from an underlying stats point of view, and to see whether they're actually good picks to continue going with, or whether they're actually picks that we should look towards actually buying in the future. So that's kind of my take on the expected goal involvement leaders so far. And now it's actually a time to actually look at team strength. So with team strength, what I would like to do is actually look at this season so far. Very, very small sample size. We've only got 4 games so far. As I said, of course, Luton and Burnley both playing one less game than everyone else. So actually, what I've done is created this sort of scatter plot here in 4 quadrants, and I've sort of put, good attacks, good defenses in that top right quadrant, good attack, bad defense in that bottom right quadrant, bad attack, bad defense in that bottom left quadrant, and then bad attack, good defense in the top left quadrant. What's interesting so far, of course, is you can see there's still a huge gulf in some teams, right? Even within, let's say, the good attack, good defense quadrant, we're seeing a huge gulf between, let's say, a West Ham, their offensive capability versus, let's say, Brentford. Because expected goals, which is that sort of top x-axis over there, you can actually see that someone like Brentford is leading as a top team in the attacking point of view from the Premier League, which is a huge shock. They were more so, I'd say, a mid-table kind of attack last season, and the fact that they're completely leading, even though we already knew that they had good fixtures, is a really positive sign, because you can see, of course, already higher expected goal involvement than some teams that you would expect to be very, very good from the attacking point of view, like a City, like an Arsenal, like a Brighton. So that's huge. And when you're looking at, let's say, Newcastle, of course, quite poor, but you have to also contextualize that as having bad fixtures. So when we're looking ahead, I would say very interesting to see that Newcastle still remain in that quadrant. Good sign, of course, given that they have good fixtures ahead. With a team like Chelsea, very, very good, promising early signs where you could say, yes, of course, even though a pick like Jackson or a pick like Chilwell so far hasn't really impressed too much, but actually, if they have good fixtures going forwards and they're continuing to perform like a top 4 or 5 team right now, actually, they could be really, really good holds. And the same thing I'd say, of course, with, let's say, Brighton attackers, even though they actually have really tough fixtures. So I would still consider selling. With United, for example, as a team that really are struggling with defensive injuries, they're starting to slip, and that's not a really positive sign. With Tottenham, of course, interesting to see that they're a little bit lower in terms of the attack based on our expectations. I think a lot of people see Tottenham, for example, as one of the best attacks so far. However, they haven't created too many expected goals, which probably suggests that they've been overperforming just a bit. However, we know that they also have incredibly clinical finishers. For example, Son and Madison are both some of the most clinical finishers we've actually seen, with recorded history of football for the last 3 to 4 years. So actually, you could suggest that those two assets are still really, really good because we know that they're clinical finishers. And the fact that they're still building decent XG to sort of put them in that top quadrant already suggests that they're great assets. Whereas with Liverpool, for example, you can see that they're no longer one of those top teams based on our I would say not prehistoric, but historic expectations. They're still, however, performing very, very well. And actually, we would argue that Liverpool's fixture swing improves. So looking at teams like Tottenham and Liverpool, they're definitely teams that I would target in the future. And then actually, when you're looking at Everton and even a team like West Ham, the fact that they're finding themselves in this quadrant, despite, let's say, Everton having really poor results and then actually West Ham having really, really good results, also suggests that there's a little bit of overperformance, I would say, from the West Ham point of view, and then a little bit of underperformance, of course, dramatically from this Everton team as well. Whereas when you look at that sort of bottom left quadrant, because Burnley and Luton haven't played, that additional game, they probably would actually become a very, very clear standout bad attack, bad defense team. And Fulham, of course, the worst team so far. Part of that too is Palhinha only coming back, that Bayern Munich deal getting cancelled. So, for example, that having an impact on overall how Fulham are perceived as a team and how strong they are defensively. The Tim Ream red card as well impacting the expected goals conceded as well. And when you look at, let's say, other teams, I think Nottingham Forest and Crystal Palace, very interesting to see them in that sort of top left quadrant where you can argue that they're a bad attack and good defense. And actually, that's sort of historically what this Crystal Palace team has been. They've been pretty poor at attack, but they have some great players in terms of Eze, who play 90 minutes, so he can still be a great pick going forwards. But overall, actually, their defense is absolutely stand out, and they do lack compared to, let's say, the top 6, top 8 in terms of the attacking quality. So Crystal Palace, an interesting team going forwards. May be interesting to see, of course, who becomes that sort of starting keeper, because they're still at a very, very good price. And of course, access to a good defense is very nice. At the same time, of course, when you're looking at good attack versus bad attack or good defense versus bad defense, that doesn't really encapsulate things like saves. And for example, someone like Brentford and someone like Flecken, that team concedes a lot of low XG chances, which makes them still a relatively good defense, slightly worse than Crystal Palace, but they could actually get more avenues to points because they're actually making a lot more saves. Whereas historically, you're looking at Crystal Palace goalkeepers, they don't get to make too many saves. Nottingham Forest, though, very good, promising early data so far. I think that because they've also had a couple new transfers, our expectations of them could change going forwards, and we need a little bit more data to sort of understand where we sort of place them. Wolves so far in Bournemouth, not too good. And I think we do expect them to sort of be in the mix in terms of the relegation race. And then when you look at that sort of bottom right quadrant, once again, readdressing teams like Aston Villa, United, and Brighton, so far the defense has been very poor. And actually, that's something that we've seen in terms of the goals conceded from United, even Aston Villa at Anfield, and then, of course, Brighton. Despite doing good in the Newcastle game, we've seen them, of course, concede 3 versus West Ham as well. So an interesting sort of point of view there to sort of look at teams like that. Could you actually look to drop off your United defenders, your Brighton defenders? I would actually say that that's actually a pretty reasonable idea. However, when we looked at someone like Cash, of course, he's a very, very easy keep at this point in time because he's such a lethal attacker. And to contextualize this as well, because this is, of course, an incredibly small sample size, what I've also done is actually looked at 11-5's team model. He's a user on Twitter or X, whatever you actually call the social platform nowadays. But the idea, of course, is he's created a team model that actually looks historically, right? Going back to, let's say, the previous season as well, looking at data including this season and having that continually update. And of course, this is a little bit more of a robust picture of some of the teams that we know. Of course, the 17 teams that we saw last season, and then the 3 teams that, of course, got promoted, where you kind of create these base expectations for these championship teams because they're championship promotion teams, and you expect them, let's say, to struggle both on attack and defense. So far, what we can see is based on the first 4 game weeks of updates and of course, all the historical data from previous years, we can still see that actually the expectations for City are absolutely stand out, and they're still one of the teams that are absolutely blowing the rest of the competition out of the water. When you look at historically as well, even going back to last season, there was a clear gulf between, let's say, a City and an Arsenal and Newcastle from a defensive point of view. And then the attack, of course, was a completely different picture as well. So very promising, of course, to see that now that we actually have access to City players at Julian Alvarez's price or even Foden's price, and that they're actually semi-nailed, of course, it actually makes sense to go into them, or even, for example, investing, as I said, in the defenders going forwards. But the weird thing about City, of course, is that they are about to hit a poor fixture swing. So actually moving into the defenders isn't something that I would literally do. I'd probably look at a team like Newcastle, who still look like a very, very resolute defense. As you can see, they're sort of rated by this team model still as that sort of second standout defense. Liverpool continually dropping. Of course, we've seen their very, very poor defense in the opening doors of the fixture so far. So they're continuing to skid down, and teams like Brighton and Man United as well are also skidding down in terms of our understanding of their defense. And with this Tottenham team, we knew that actually with, let's say, someone like Postecoglou coming in, that their defense would probably struggle as well. Last season, they conceded a lot of goals too. Less so in terms of expected goals conceded, but early signs for Tottenham still suggest that they're a pretty poor defense. And then actually with Chelsea, of course, we've seen a little bit of emergence from them. The same thing with teams like Aston Villa and Brentford, who have actually been moving up and higher into this quadrant, in this good attack, good defense quadrant. And then actually, of course, the only team that really sits in this good attack, bad defense quadrant is Tottenham. Now, of course, there's still a huge gap in terms of defensive quality between, let's say, a Tottenham team that is much closer to, let's say, Brighton and United and Brentford as a defensive unit compared to, let's say, our expectations of Luton Town and Sheffield United and what they've shown so far. So that's an interesting sort of thing. I think we can clearly look at teams like Wolves, Luton Town, and Sheffield United as teams to target. What we did say, of course, is that the early data for Nottingham Forest has been quite good. So maybe actually they're not no longer a team to target, at least from a kind of clean sheets point of view. We've known that players like Taiwo Awoniyi, even Gibbs White have actually really good expected goal involvement so far. And then Burnley, Bournemouth, they've been actually pretty poor as well from a defensive point of view. Definitely teams that I would think about targeting. Everton, of course, conceding a calamitous amount versus Aston Villa, but so far have actually been a relatively decent team. And Fulham, of course, I expect them to continue dropping down in this table, given their sort of performance so far. But if they are able to rectify this, then maybe they can stay, just on the edge of that sort of good attack quadrant as well. As far as bad attack, good defense, the only team that's actually sitting here from a historical point of view and looking at these kind of 4 fixtures is Crystal Palace. And we saw them, of course, in the previous quadrant as well when we're looking at expected goal involvement. That's a really positive sign because actually it still suggests that we have quite a bit of historical faith that this Crystal Palace team is a good defense, as I mentioned. And so, of course, if you're actually looking at, let's say, a very safe goalkeeper, someone who's probably, I would say, not explosive, like someone like Raya last season or even Leno, then, of course, Crystal Palace is that sort of player to target, or Crystal Palace is that sort of team and club to target. Whereas, as I said, there are some teams like a West Ham, a Brentford, and Aston Villa. They're sort of in the midst of all these quadrants and very able to actually move upwards and downwards, or even left and right. And of course, we just need a little bit more sample size to sort of determine whether they actually are the teams that we want to invest in. The simple reality, too, is though, for example, players like Matty Cash or Mbumo are extremely well priced. Even someone like Bowen is a little bit higher priced compared to Mbumo. So therefore, why not just look at players from this Brentford team like an Mbumo or a Wisa so far? And that makes a lot of sense. So that's sort of my international breakdown. I hope it helps you guys in terms of your early thinking, in terms of what we've seen so far, and then also taking a little bit of a historical perspective as well from FPL. I hope it's a little bit of a change of pace as well, where you can actually look back, maybe assess what you actually think about the teams, and let me know what you guys think in the comments in terms of this video. I hope it helps you. I'll probably be looking at a wildcard windows video, a little bit more of FPL strategy, since we have a little bit more of a downtime and a break before I go back to the regular scheduled content like the cheat sheet and things like that. I think it's a good time as well, using the wildcard windows video, to also reflect on that double game week going so far. And also, honestly, just touching on the double game week, we've seen a lot of the data already for teams like Luton and Burnley. Not very positive expectations, to be quite honest. And for that same reason, I would say don't overreact to double game week 7. It's just a double game week where we have very, very weak teams. It's not often that we actually overreact to this, and I would encourage people not to do so as well. Unless you have a really, really well-planned strategy, you already have some bench players from these teams, such as a Kabori, etc., and you really want to use some sort of bench boost 7 strategy, which I probably would still advise against, but if you want to do that, that's totally fair. Of course, just understand that the expectations for these teams, even when they're sort of facing each other, or in Everton, for example, that it's not particularly great. And that's just my early thoughts so far. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.